Welcome everyone to MailFuzz TV. I am Peter and today I'm going to be talking about the Twilight Zone Season 5 Episode 26. It's called I Am the Night, Color Me Black. So spoilers for the episode. This is about a man who is going to be executed. He is going to be hanged in the morning, and there's a mysterious occurrence that the sun just does not rise. It does not come up. It's meant to have already be daylight, and instead they're still in the middle of night, and no one knows why. But it's it almost feels like I shouldn't even say it's an obvious metaphor, because Rod Serling at the end of the episode, when he's given his outro, kind of beats you over the head with it and makes it clear what it was anyway. So it's not even like you have to read it and understand it for yourself. Rod's going to tell you by the end that the darkness represents the hate. It represents all these feelings. It represents this desire for vengeance and discontent, and the idea that it's spreading. The end of this episode is we hear that other parts of the world are starting to have darkness creep in despite the time of day. And it mentions a couple of notable places. It mentions like a political prison somewhere. It mentions the Berlin Wall. It mentions the north half of Vietnam. So there's definitely a lot of like blatant messaging in kind of what this episode is doing. And I think I kind of like it in concept, and I like some of the way that it kind of paints a picture of what happened with this guy who's up for execution without going into it in too much depth. But at the same time, I do also think it gets a little bit speechy and characters start speaking almost in poetry to sort of wax lyrically about what they're talking about. There's like a newspaper man who starts talking about what's going on and giving speeches. There's a reverend towards the end of the episode that's giving speeches. So I'm kind of conflicted about the episode because I kind of like more or less what it's doing, and I like that it's a more kind of morality. It's a morality story, but I'd say it's even less of a story and more of just kind of like a meditation on hatred and the desire for it and kind of the mob mentality, but not in a way where it's not the story of Frankenstein where the mob's coming out with pitchforks. It's implied that there's pitchforks, and we kind of do see a crowd longing for this man's death, but it's kind of more about poking out the reasons behind it and if they should feel guilt for it. And there's one or two characters who are kind of feeling guilty about their role in this execution, and that stuff's interesting. But it does feel like it is kind of beating you over the head with some of the metaphors by the end. And on top of all that, Rod at the end of the episode, when he's doing his outro, normally he will say something kind of flowery about the episode, and he'll end up by saying such and such in the Twilight Zone, or they've traveled through the Twilight Zone. He'll always say something like that. It was notable at the end of this episode that he didn't do that. He instead said, don't look for this type of darkness or this type of hatred in the Twilight Zone. Instead, look in the mirror. He's basically saying, hey, this was an episode about the real world. This was an episode about what's going on all over the planet right now. Look to yourself and try and stop this type of hate or these types of feelings from spreading. He blatantly says that at the end of the episode. So, on the one hand, like, obviously the intentions of it are very noble, and I get what it's going for, and I think some of the performances in the episode are very good, but I am kind of conflicted about how much it does beat you over the head with its ideas. So, yeah, I don't know. And obviously there's some interesting episodes you could compare it to in terms of, we've done mob mentality episodes before. We've done the crowd gets revved up. That's kind of a Monsters During Maple Street kind of thing. We've done stories about execution. Even a man being hanged was not that long ago, with that sort of imported episode. So, it's definitely playing in the sandbox with a lot of ideas that we've had before. But I think I'm at my most interested in this episode when it's sort of dealing with the different perspectives of the people in this morning where this man is going to be executed. The episode opens with the sheriff getting ready for work, and his wife wakes up kind of groggy in bed and says, why are you up so early? Because it's like 6 a.m. or something like that. Like, why are you putting this much effort in this morning? Like, this man that's going to be... Well, why are you making such a fuss over the fact that we're executing this guy? He deserves it. Like, she's very kind of flippant about it. Like, it's not important. Like his life doesn't matter. And the sheriff's attitude's very different. He's like, no, this is a big deal. And it's the sheriff's wife's responsibility to like make this man breakfast and bring it to him later in the morning. And she kind of like says, "How does he like his eggs?" But it's a very kind of flippant, like she's like, it's not in good faith. She's kind of like implying that she doesn't care about the quality of the meal she gives him. And the sheriff kind of barks back, "Edible. It's the last food you'll ever have, so make it edible." And he gets very stern about it. And she just kind of pretends to go back to sleep at one point in the scene. And it kind of paints this picture where even this married couple are very different opinions. The sheriff's clearly feeling the weight of the fact they're about to kill someone. And the wife's like, it's an execution. He deserves it. That's just what we should be doing today. And then that's further extended when we get to the little police station in this village, and the deputy is very much out for blood. He's very much openly mocking the fact that, "Oh, I reminded the prisoner what day it is." Like, he's got a smug look in his face. Like, he's excited about today. He's got the thirst for the blood. And the sheriff, again, does not feel that way. And even more so is the reporter who comes in, this older man who's a newspaper guy. He comes in and kind of like points out some important things to the audience. And I kind of liked these details coming up, was that, that this is not a clear-cut execution. There's a reason to feel bad about it, right? Most of the town seems to be out for the blood, but we learn some details here that, the deputy who's seemingly quite up for this and is kind of smug about the whole affair, he was actually a witness to this crime. And the prisoner, it was supposed to be self-defense. This was an altercation with someone else. And the reporter flat out just accuses the deputy of perjury, that he lied about what happened because he was taking a side. And as we go throughout the episode, we find out as well that this crime, or this man that was murdered, was not a good person. That's something else the reporter brings up, that this was someone who was burning crosses. They never outright say he was a member of the KKK, but that's very much what the implication is from everything they say about this person. And that there was gunpowder residue or whatever on the body, which would imply that he was also firing shots. But conveniently, there was no autopsy done. There was no examination of the body. He was buried as quickly as possible, so they couldn't examine the body. And it sounds like the sheriff's got a lot of guilt because when he was told there wasn't going to be this extended examination, he was happy to just sort of nod his head and go along with it. And there's a moment later in the episode when they're actually at the gallows where he says, I kind of accepted that because on some level, I know that the majority of the town want this man to be guilty and to be executed for this murder. And he's aware that he's up for election. He's up for re-election to be sheriff in the next year or whatever. So he's kind of admitting that there's kind of a reason why he just went along with the crowd in the moment, because he wants them to like him for this reason for later. But now he's feeling remorse over this. So this whole idea of like withholding certain bits of information and letting things slide because the majority, that's a big topic in the back half of the episode when the Reverend's given the big speech at the end after the man has been killed. It's all about the idea of going with the majority and all there is the majority. And yeah, so it's really poking at some big things. So obviously the picture it paints is that, the man who was killed was a bastard, and he was, at the very least, very racist, if not an outright member of the KKK. And it does paint an interesting image when we see the crowd form at the gallows, where you notice that there's black people in the crowd, and presumably, I would imagine they're feeling very differently than to the white characters who are basically just screaming for this guy to be killed. And this idea that they just see it's almost like the episode is pushing a lot of ideas as far as it can get away with for the time period, and in this like early to mid 60s network TV show. I do wonder if they wrote this episode a couple of decades later, if the person who was up for execution might just be a black character rather than a white character. But maybe not. Maybe part of the point of this is the idea of this character to the rest of this town has become this villain, and they just want this justice, but it's not really justice. It's just this mob mentality. But the entire system has failed to actually look into this, and even the character. So Jagger is the name of the prisoner, And we see him eventually in the first half of the episode, right after we get our big scene where the reporter's talking to the sheriff and the deputy. He goes in to speak to him. And this is like, simultaneously, I kind of like some of the ideas that come up in this conversation where the reporters try to say, hey, do you want a statement? Do you want a final statement? I can put it in the paper. Everyone should deserve that. But at the same time, this is also where I think the episode started to lose me a little bit in terms of how it was written, because I felt like a lot of the dialogue back and forth was a little bit too smart for its own good, a little bit too metaphorical, and a little bit too fancy for the characters that are supposed to be speaking. I think especially the prisoner, you know, if we're buying this idea that he's someone who stood up to this other guy, it kind of feels like we're painting this idea that all of these characters, this is like a small village, it's a lot of working class people, but yeah, it feels like we're getting almost Shakespearean, like, back and forth with these two characters. It kind of felt, maybe it makes sense that the newspaper man's a little bit better spoken because he's literally a writer. He's literally someone who does this for a living. But the prisoner, it felt like, was very well spoken and was very good at implying a lot of things. In fact, I think a lot of this episode just implies things. It doesn't outright say them, which is also kind of one of its strengths in a way, because it's just kind of like, again, trying to subtly build what this town is like, and how there's this majority who just wants this man to be killed for killing another white man. And, you know, it really paints the attitude of what's going on in the town. And I appreciate that, but it also sometimes sounds a bit too fancy for its own good. And I think this scene between the prisoner and the reporter was very much where I was really starting to feel that. And it doesn't get better either. I think once we're at the gallows and they're making these speeches in front of everyone, I think the prisoner is a little bit better in that scene because he gets a bit more emotional and passionate about just not giving the satisfaction of, like, apologizing. But he also doesn't want to, like, take some big side. It's not like he wants, like, to seek comfort, and, you know, he never wanted to see the Reverend, and the Reverend happens to be black. And he said that, you know, the prisoner wouldn't let me see him. And when he tries to speak to him on the way up to the gallows, it's not like he's friendly with him either. He's very much someone who is, like, just kind of bitter about the rest of society. Even he has hatred in him now for just, like, the situation he's in, for the people around him. And there's also interspersed here, like, you know, side characters talking about the darkness and why is it still dark? It's now 8:30 a.m. It should be light now. It should be bright. It should be sunny. It's an interesting episode because it really is just talking about all the incidents that the episode talks about all happened before the episode started. It's all about the aftermath of whatever went down, and it's all about the aftermath of how it was investigated and how many people turned a blind eye to whatever it was because they want this neat, easy solution. But there is this mob. There's these people who are screaming for his death, and there's a woman who yells out, "Just get it over with, kill him." And it's this idea of the burning sort of negativity and hatred, and, you know, it's this literal cloud effectively that's hanging over the entire town, and the darkness is spreading. So you get this moment at the end when they're back at the station. We hear on the radio that all these other places are starting to have this same problem, and the camera pulls back to this really, really wide shot gradually as the radio is playing, and the scene gets darker. Like, they're sort of taking out the light of the scene, so they look very, very in shadows by the end of it. And it really feels like the episode just ends with this moment where it stops and Rod tells the audience, the world is going to shit, and we have to try and be better. We have to not let hate drive us. We have to actually think about what we're doing. And yeah, the sentiment's great, but it does feel a little bit of a PSA by the end, as opposed to just a story in its own right. There are good little moments, though, of direction. There's a great bit where when the prisoner arrives at the gallows, where he talks to the people a little bit and, you know, says some of his stuff, but when he actually starts walking up the steps and he looks up and sees the noose for the first time, his face is perfectly framed inside the noose. It's looking down from behind the noose. I thought that was really well done. Like, the gravity of what was about to happen is kind of hitting, right? And, like, the emotions are running higher. It's interesting. There's a lot of conflict between the sheriff and his deputy, because his deputy, like, throughout the entire thing, because even at the end of the episode, the deputy is the one who's saying, this darkness is nothing. It's just, like, a really bad fog. It's going to lift. It's going to be just normal daytime again. Like, this idea that he's deluding himself and trying to convince himself that everything's going to go back to normal and it's just fine. But no, the specter of what they've done is always going to be here. That's the metaphor. You know, it's always going to be lingering over them that this happened, and that this execution, which maybe probably most likely by the sounds of it shouldn't have been an execution, happened, and all these people on some level are to blame for it, right? I mean, the Reverend even says to the crowd, like, you know, you've just killed this man. Like, you hated him for killing another, and now you've killed him because you believed he deserved death for killing someone, and now all of you wanted him to die, so now you're all damned. So, yeah, it's definitely effective at points. It's definitely good performances. I like some moments of direction, but I do think the writing gets a little bit too, you know, I think if the characters felt more like real people instead of like their characters making speeches, I think it might have had landed even better and been a little bit more subtle. I think I would have liked that, but obviously that's not what Rod Serling was going for here. He was going for, I'm making a statement and I'm going to spell it out to the audience by the end, and I don't think that's for the better of the episode, certainly, even though the sentiment's obviously very good. I guess we'll look ahead at next time then. That's my thoughts on that episode. I don't even think I remember. Rod did show up at the end. I think I was too busy thinking about his final monologue of the episode to actually pay attention to what he was saying about the next one. But luckily, we're going to look at IMDb. It's called Sounds and Silences, and the description is as follows. Roswell Flemington enjoys loud noises, is an annoyance to others, and is suitably punished. Okay. Notably, this is Richard Donner directing this next one, and he directed one of the best episodes previously, and is a good movie director. So we'll see how that goes next time. But let me know what you thought of this episode of Twilight Zone in the comments. Like, subscribe, all that stuff helps out a bunch. And of course, you can support all the content over at patreon.com/MailFuzzTV and help keep the lights on. But yeah, we've only got about 10 episodes of the show left. Don't know what I'm replacing it with yet. Still deciding. But thank you very much. I'll see you guys next time. Keep watching TV in the Twilight Zone.